They say Judas betrayed Jesus for silver, that he kissed him in the dark, sold him to the priests, and vanished into the night damned for eternity. But what if that story was never meant to be understood? What if it was a performance, choreographed, rehearsed, and obeyed? What if the only disciple who truly understood Jesus was the one we've all been taught to hate? Because maybe, just maybe, Judas didn't betray. Maybe he obeyed. Let the chaos fade now. Let the garden grow still, the torches dim. You're not here for noise or outrage. You're here to listen, to peer into a story that history sealed shut with wax, with fire, with fear. But wax melts, fire fades, and fear forgets. It begins not with a kiss, but with a manuscript. Fragile, cracked. A bundle of papyrus buried for centuries in the Egyptian desert, waiting like a whisper beneath the sand. In 2006, when it finally surfaced, the Gospel of Judas scholars flinched. Here was a gospel where Judas wasn't a villain. He was a confidant, the only one it claimed who truly grasped Jesus' vision. A vision too radical for the others to carry. A vision too dangerous to survive. The church quickly dismissed it as heresy. But then again, the church once dismissed Galileo too. So tonight, you and I will wander down a different path. We'll read the texts they buried. Listen for the echoes in old stone walls. Trace symbols carved into forgotten chapels, and ask questions that once got people burned at the stake. Was Judas the betrayer? Or was he something far more unsettling, the only one willing to do what had to be done? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The story doesn't begin in Jerusalem or even Rome, but in a cave, a place that had no reason to remember the world above it. Somewhere near El Minya, Egypt, in the dry stillness of the 1970s, a farmer struck something with his shovel. Not gold, not pottery, paper, or what was left of it, thick, crumbling sheets bound together by time and secrecy. No one knew it yet, but the world had just rediscovered Judas. The codex passed from hand to hand like contraband, smuggled through black markets, wrapped in newspaper, stuffed into briefcases that crossed borders under false names. By the time it reached scholars decades later, the papyrus was nearly dust-eaten by humidity, greed, and neglect. But even through the decay, one name survived. Written in Coptic Judas, Judas, the disciple of Jesus, and what it claimed would make every painting, every sermon, every Easter story tremble. Because in this text, Judas wasn't damned. He was enlightened. According to the Gospel of Judas, Jesus laughed at the prayers of his other disciples. He told Judas alone the truth of creation, a cosmic vision of realms and angels and the flawed world of men. He told Judas that he would sacrifice the man who clothes me, not the divine essence, but the mortal shell. It was an instruction, a request, betrayal or obedience. Even now, scholars can't agree. Some say it's pure Gnosticism, that in this vision Judas helps Jesus shed his earthly body to return to the divine pleroma, the fullness of light. Others claim it's poetic blasphemy written by heretics who delighted in scandalizing orthodoxy. Yet the words have a strange peace to them, like someone describing a task they were born to do. You can almost picture Judas listening, confused but resolute. In the canonical Gospels, he's silent. In this one, he speaks. He asks questions. He argues. He understands. And for that, he's rewarded not with silver, but with knowledge. Jesus tells him that he will exceed all of them. It's a chilling compliment considering what happens next. The physical gospel itself is real enough. carbon dated to the 3rd or 4th century, written in Sahidic Coptic, translated from an older Greek original. It isn't a modern forgery. It's a voice from the same ancient world that gave us Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only this one was buried, deliberately forgotten. The question is, why? When the National Geographic Society unveiled the restored codex in 2006, headlines exploded with words like rehabilitation and redemption. Suddenly, Judas was back in the conversation, no longer just a cautionary figure hanging from a tree, but a possible co-conspirator in the divine plan. The Vatican issued a statement that was, let's say, measured. It reminded readers that apocryphal texts were nothing new, that this one was late, and that the canonical story stood firm. But a quiet anxiety rippled through theological circles. If this gospel was authentic, if it truly reflected an early Christian stream of thought, then the narrative of treachery might not be the whole picture. Here's where the academic debates turn almost poetic. Some scholars argue that the Gospel of Judas was a Gnostic parody, mocking those who clung to a literal crucifixion. Others see it as a meditative reflection, a dialogue between teacher and student exploring the paradox of divine will. Either way, the figure of Judas becomes something else entirely. Not the snake in the garden, but the gardener himself, pruning what must die for what must bloom. The discovery itself raises uncomfortable parallels, because this wasn't the first time Egypt yielded forbidden gospels. A few decades earlier, in 1945, the Nag Hammadi Library had surfaced from the same kind of desert silence. Inside were books that spoke of secret teachings, divine sparks trapped in flesh salvation through knowledge rather than faith. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and now Judas. Each one rewrote the idea of who got to understand God and who didn't. It's almost poetic justice that Judas returned from the ground. For centuries, artists painted him in shadow, the crooked nose, the bag of coins, the kiss that doomed heaven itself. Yet here he was, dug out of the dust, like truth rising from its grave. The church called him the betrayer. The text called him the only one who listened. Which do you believe? And somewhere between those pages, cracked, faded, smelling of rot and resurrection, you begin to wonder if the story of Judas was always meant to hurt. Maybe his name was a vessel for guilt, a mirror for human weakness. Maybe the church needed a villain to make the hero shine brighter. But if the Gospel of Judas tells even a fragment of truth, then the betrayal might not have been a sin. It might have been the holiest act of all, the final obedience of a disciple who understood his teacher too well. The papyrus closes there, half torn, with Judas receiving a vision and stepping into the night. The others are asleep. Only the wind hears his footsteps. Only the desert keeps the secret. And you're beginning to see the pattern forming, faint but insistent. Because this isn't just a lost text. It's a confession whispered across time. A reminder that history's villains are often history's most faithful listeners. You start to feel it, that subtle split beneath the surface of faith. The difference between the Jesus most of the world knows and the one whispered about in buried scrolls. The former walks the dusty roads of Galilee, healing, teaching, feeding crowds. The latter moves through dreams and visions, speaking in riddles about the universe, about divine sparks and false gods. And at the center of that fracture stands Judas, trying to understand which Jesus he was really following. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus speaks plainly to the crowds and cryptically to his disciples. He heals blindness, calms storms, multiplies loaves. He's a man of miracles and mercy, grounded in the world around him. But in the Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and now the Gospel of Judas, the tone changes. Here Jesus laughs when his disciples misunderstand him. He tells them the material world is an illusion, a flawed creation made by lesser beings called archons. He isn't just a savior. He's a revealer, someone trying to awaken others from the dream of matter. It's hard not to notice how that tone fits Judas better than anyone else. Judas, who always saw through the surface. Judas, who questioned the motives of miracles and the purpose of suffering. In a world where faith was measured by obedience, he was the one asking why, and in a Gnostic context, that question isn't rebellion, it's worship. To seek knowledge, to pierce illusion, to understand the deeper mechanism of divinity. The word gnosis means knowledge, not academic knowledge, but a visceral awakening. The Gnostic Jesus doesn't die for your sins. He dies to show you how to wake up. And Judas, if this narrative holds true, becomes the student chosen to pull the final thread. The one entrusted with the most painful lesson that truth demands, letting go of everything, even the body of God himself. That idea terrified the early church, because Gnosticism turned power inward. It didn't need priests or altars or temples. It said salvation wasn't something given, it was remembered. That the divine spark already lived inside you, waiting to be recognized. In that world, Judas's act wasn't betrayal, but initiation. He wasn't handing Jesus over to the Romans. He was helping him transcend the false prison of flesh. It's almost poetic and almost heretical. You can feel the unease in the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian centuries later. They fought the Gnostics fiercely, calling them corrupters of truth, children of darkness who distorted the gospel. But behind their condemnation lies a strange anxiety, as if the Gnostic view of Jesus was too intimate, too liberating. If knowledge itself could save what power was left for the hierarchy that claimed to hold the keys to heaven, Judas becomes the perfect scapegoat for that anxiety. His story retold through orthodox lenses becomes the ultimate warning question too deeply, and you become the betrayer. Seek truth outside the institution, and you'll hang yourself in regret. It's a lesson repeated not just in sermons but in centuries of silence. But the Gnostic Jesus keeps slipping through. You see him in early Coptic hymns and mystical writings preserved by desert monks who refused to destroy them. You even find echoes in modern philosophy, the idea that awakening is painful, that truth costs everything. And in that light, Judas's story feels less like treason and more like tragedy. The tragedy of being the only one willing to do what must be done, even if no one would ever understand it. The difference between the two Jesuses is more than theological, it's emotional. The canonical Christ comforts you. The Gnostic Jesus challenges you. The first offers forgiveness. The second demands awareness. And it's awareness, not forgiveness, that Judas seems to have sought. Awareness of what Jesus truly meant when he spoke of the kingdom of heaven being within. That's what makes the Gospel of Judas so provocative. It doesn't just ask who betrayed whom. It asks whether humanity has misunderstood the entire mission. If Jesus intended to free spirit from matter, then Judas's betrayal was the necessary mechanism, the unlocking of the door. That thought alone reframes the crucifixion not as tragedy, but as the ultimate collaboration. Of course, no one likes the idea that betrayal might be holy. It undermines centuries of moral simplicity. It blurs lines that religion worked hard to draw. But you can feel the tension humming beneath the surface of both traditions, the light and the shadow orbiting each other. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the truth of Judas isn't about choosing between the canonical Christ and the Gnostic Jesus. Maybe it's about realizing they were never separate. The healer and the revealer, the teacher of the crowds and the whisperer in the night, both sides of the same cosmic riddle. As you imagine Judas standing before that paradox, You can almost hear the faint laughter of a teacher who knows what comes next. The one who told his disciple to do quickly what he must do. The one who knew that death wasn't an ending, but a doorway. And the one who, even as the torches approached, smiled because someone understood. The echo of that understanding lingers through centuries. The Church would define heresy and orthodoxy canon and apocrypha saint and sinner. But in the quiet spaces between those definitions, something else survives, a whisper from the old manuscripts, saying that knowledge and faith were never enemies. That maybe Judas wasn't the man who turned away from God, but the one who saw him too clearly. And so the question remains, who is easier to follow, the Jesus who promises to save you, or the one who asks you to understand him? Judas chose the harder path. And for that, history wrote him out. There's something strange about how little the other disciples seem to understand Judas. In every retelling of the Last Supper, the betrayal comes as a shock. "Is it I, Lord?" they ask each in turn, as though the notion of one among them being disloyal was unthinkable. But one of them already knew. And one of them, depending on which gospel you prefer, was already slipping out into the night. What if Judas wasn't the outlier, but the one who had been closest all along? The idea that Judas was Jesus's favorite disciple is, to be fair, not something you're likely to hear on Sunday morning. It undermines the clear-cut morality tale that's been etched into centuries of stained glass. But look closer. The canonical Gospels give Judas very little development, almost like a character slotted into a role that needed filling. He appears, he acts, he dies. But in the Gospel of Judas, there's a strange intimacy. Jesus takes him aside, speaks to him privately, confides in him with cosmic secrets about stars, aeons, divine realms, things the others apparently weren't ready to hear. It's an unsettling reversal. In the traditional narrative, the beloved disciple is usually assumed to be John, the one who reclines next to Jesus, the one entrusted with the care of Mary. But that title, the one whom Jesus loved, is vague. It never says John by name. It never says it wasn't Judas. What if the gospel writers or the editors after them had reason to obscure that detail? What if the closeness between Jesus and Judas was too inconvenient to preserve? Of course, that's a dangerous line of thinking. The early church worked hard to protect the sanctity of its founding narrative, and any suggestion that Judas held a privileged place within it would unravel more than just character arcs. It would call into question the nature of betrayal itself, because how do you brand a man as traitor when the teacher loved him most? And there's another curious detail. In some apocryphal texts, Judas is not just the receiver of secrets, but the only one who comprehends Jesus's laughter, a motif that shows up again and again in Gnostic literature. Jesus laughs at the ignorance of those who think they understand even his own followers. But Judas, it seems, never gets laughed at. He gets answers. Some interpretations go further. They suggest that Judas might have been a cousin of Jesus, perhaps even a spiritual twin, much like Thomas was called Didymus the twin. These were familial metaphors, yes, but in an oral tradition where metaphor and mysticism blurred. It's easy to imagine how a disciple like Judas could have once occupied a position of trust, only to be rewritten as the villain in a later draft. Think of it this way. If Judas were a mere outsider, a disposable antagonist, why would Jesus keep him so close? Why would he entrust him with the group's money of all things, even in traditional texts? Judas is the treasurer. You don't give the purse to someone you don't trust, unless the trust was deeper and the fall all the more devastating. There's also a literary pattern at work here. The idea of the beloved who falls is not unique to Christianity. In ancient myths, the favored one often becomes the sacrifice. The one closest to the divine is asked to shoulder the burden of separation. Think of Prometheus bringing fire and suffering the consequence, or Lucifer, the morning star, cast out for ambition. The favorite becomes the fallen, but not necessarily the evil. Just the one chosen to bear a truth too heavy for others. That kind of framing lends Judas an uncomfortable nobility. If he was the favorite, the most trusted, then his role wasn't just essential, it was devastating. To be asked by the person you love most to do the unthinkable. To carry the blame, to wear the mask of villainy, so that the greater purpose could unfold. That's not betrayal. That's martyrdom in reverse. The canonical texts hint at this complexity, even if unintentionally. In Matthew, after Judas returns the silver and confesses, "I have sinned," by betraying innocent blood, he isn't refuted. No voice tells him, "No, you did what was necessary." He receives no comfort, only silence, the kind that lingers when people refuse to speak a truth they fear. And then there's the kiss. Not a shove, not an accusation. A kiss. Even in the most damning version of the story, Jesus doesn't flinch. He looks at Judas and calls him friend. Not traitor, not demon, friend. The moment is so tender it's unsettling. Unless, of course, it wasn't meant as a condemnation, but as recognition. Judas the favorite. Judas the chosen. Judas the one who understood and obeyed and carried the weight alone. If that version of the story is true, then it isn't just Judas who was misrepresented. It's Jesus too. Because a teacher is defined by the students they trust with their hardest truths. And the hardest truth of all was how it had to end. You begin to see how the pieces shift. A gospel here, a gesture there. The shadows cast by light that was never meant to be direct. And through it all, the haunting possibility that the disciple we were taught to despise might have been the one who was closest to understanding what none of the others could. That love, real, piercing, and selfless, might have looked like betrayal from the outside. Coins always clink louder when placed on a table. 30 silver pieces. That's the amount we're told Judas accepted for delivering Jesus into the hands of the priests, a figure so seared into Western consciousness it became synonymous with betrayal itself. But money-like motive is rarely simple, and those coins may not be what they seem. The Gospel of Matthew is the only one that names the amount 30 pieces of silver, a detail precise enough to be symbolic. In fact, it mirrors a passage from the book of Zechariah, where a shepherd is paid 30 pieces to break his covenant with the people, a price that was even then considered an insult. In that context, the amount becomes a literary echo. Not so much a receipt of treason, but a prophecy fulfilled, or staged, depending on who was telling the story. It's worth asking, why would Judas need to be paid at all? He wasn't a bounty hunter. He wasn't a stranger. He traveled with Jesus for years, shared bread and dust and danger. He held the purse strings of their ministry. If anyone had access to communal funds, it was him. So why accept silver from the very authorities they were both defying, unless it wasn't payment, unless it was ritual, or perhaps record-keeping? In temple culture, transactions were often ceremonial, offerings for atonement, for redemption, for release. And Judas, being the group's treasurer, would have understood the symbolic weight of coin. Maybe the silver wasn't a reward, maybe it was a transfer. A mark of something agreed upon quietly behind closed doors. Some scholars propose that Judas's arrangement with the priests was not born out of greed, but out of calculation. That he believed, perhaps naively, that Jesus would use the arrest to trigger a demonstration of power. That by handing him over, Judas was pushing the movement into the spotlight, forcing the moment of revolution. A dangerous assumption, of course, but not an illogical one. And then, there's the curious matter of what the priests do with the money after Judas throws it back. They call it blood money, declaring it unfit for the temple treasury. So they buy a field, the potter's field, a burial place for foreigners. A dark twist of irony, perhaps, or an uncomfortable truth that the system that orchestrated Jesus' death still had rules about cleanliness. Judas, for all his supposed guilt, tried to return the coins. The priests, for all their authority, washed their hands of it, literally and figuratively. But let's dig even deeper. In Jewish legal tradition, certain transactions required witnesses. Could the act of Judas receiving silver have been part of a ritual contract, a symbolic enactment of sacrifice? In this light, Judas becomes less of a betrayer and more of a participant in a ceremony, one that the others failed to understand. And that understanding, or lack thereof, might explain why Judas acts alone, why he doesn't confer with the others, why he slips out of the meal with a whisper, not a speech. Because his mission isn't one for group consensus. It's solitary. He and Jesus perhaps have already spoken, already agreed, already wept maybe at what it would mean. Of course, this paints Judas in a different hue, not as a traitor, but as a servant of fate, one who takes on the burden of action so that prophecy can unfold. And prophecy, like any story told in retrospect, always comes with rewrites. Perhaps the silver was never about wealth. Perhaps it was the price of being the scapegoat, of wearing the mask. There's also the unsettling possibility that the entire silver exchange was retrofitted, that early gospel writers added it not because it happened, but because it had to happen to fulfill Scripture, to frame Judas within the mold of villainy. The motive of greed is neat, understandable, relatable, but far too convenient, far too small for the seismic consequences that followed. And if you squint just right, the echoes stretch farther. In ancient mystery religions, the betrayer is often the catalyst, the one who breaks the circle so that the god can die, descend, and resurrect. It's a pattern older than Rome, older than Jerusalem. Judas might not have known that he was stepping into myth, but someone did. Now picture the coins again. Cold, small, ancient, their weight symbolic, their use debated. Were they truly silver? Were they Tyrian shekels, the currency of the temple? Did they even exist in Judas's hand? Or were they metaphors all along forged in the furnace of narrative, not history? Whatever they were, they marked a line crossed. Not just in the story, but in the man. Judas, holding those coins, stands forever at the intersection of faith and suspicion. And whether he took them with trembling hands or with steady fingers, the question remains. Was it a deal with the temple or a deal with destiny? You've heard it 1,000 times, the kiss of betrayal, the torchlit garden, the disciples dozing under the olive trees, the guards closing in. And Judas stepping forward, greeting his teacher not with a blade, not with a shove, but with a kiss. It's almost too cinematic, too perfect. A gesture of love transformed into treachery. But as with everything else in this story, the more you look at it, the more it begins to bend. What if the kiss wasn't betrayal at all? What if it was a signal in the Gospel of Mark, widely considered the earliest of the 4 canonicals? Judas tells the arresting party, "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." The text is efficient. No ceremony, no emotion, just a plan. But buried in that phrasing is something strange. Why would Judas need to identify Jesus at all? They'd just spent the week in Jerusalem. He'd been preaching in the temple, publicly. He wasn't hiding behind a curtain. The guards knew who he was. Everyone did. So why the kiss? Why not just point? Why not say that one, the rabbi in the cloak, unless the gesture was meant to mean something more? A sign between two people, a code agreed upon, something intimate, yes, but also functional. There's a theory whispered among some scholars, and quietly passed over by many, that the kiss wasn't for the guards. It was for Jesus. A way of confirming the moment had come. A trigger, the final cue in a prearranged performance. Not a betrayal, but a ritual. The kind of gesture too close people might invent when words are too dangerous, too slow, or too exposed. Think about the absurdity of it. You're arresting someone, and the plan hinges on a kiss. That's theater, not strategy. Unless the moment was symbolic, meant to fulfill something larger. And fulfillment in these texts often matters more than explanation. The Gospels are full of moments that exist to echo Scripture. Jesus rides a donkey to mirror Zechariah. He's offered vinegar to echo the Psalms. The kiss might not be functional. It might be liturgical. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. In Gnostic readings, the body is a cage and knowledge is the key. If Jesus was ready to shed his mortal form not in defeat, but in transcendence, then Judas's kiss becomes the gesture that begins the process, a signal to start the sacrifice, a gentle unlocking of the door. The kiss in this light isn't malicious. It's mournful. It's duty. Judas doesn't curse. Jesus doesn't condemn him. He calls him rabbi. And Jesus doesn't recoil. He doesn't accuse. He simply says, do what you came for. Or in Luke's version, a bit more poetically, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? That line always reads like a question, but maybe it's a line in a play. One they both rehearsed. You begin to notice how the story shapes itself like a ritual drama. The garden becomes a stage. The players move with purpose. Judas steps forward, not in cowardice, but with resolve. The guards wait for their cue. Jesus' calm does not resist. It's as if the moment has been lived already in dreams, in prophecy, in private conversation, under starlit nights. Some have gone even further. There are ancient whispers that the kiss was meant to protect, that Judas's gesture wasn't about identification, but transmission. In some mystical traditions, the kiss is a conduit, a way to pass power or soul or memory. Far-fetched, perhaps. But in a story already steeped in miracles and mysteries, is it really more outlandish than walking on water or raising the dead? Or perhaps it was all much simpler and more tragic. Judas trying to hold on to tenderness in a moment that demanded cruelty. A kiss not to mark Jesus, but to say goodbye. To offer the only intimacy he could muster before the world split apart. That possibility that Judas loved Jesus and still had to hand him over might be the hardest to bear, because love and betrayal aren't always opposites. Sometimes they walk the same road. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is the one you were asked to do by someone you love. And maybe that's why the kiss hurts so much, echoing down through centuries. Not because it's wicked, but because it's necessary. The early church couldn't stomach that ambiguity. They painted the kiss as the ultimate treachery. It made for better sermons, better drama. But in doing so, they flattened the moment into caricature. Judas became the villain. The kiss became his dagger. But you and I here now can still feel the tremor beneath it. It's the tremor of two men sharing a final secret, of a plan understood by only them, of a signal given, received, and acted upon, and maybe, just maybe, of love trying to soften the horror of what was to come. It's always been curious, the silence that follows. After the betrayal, after the arrest, after the crucifixion, you might expect a flood of condemnation from the other disciples. outrage, anger, a few passionate speeches about Judas and what he did. But no, there's very little. A quiet void where you'd expect thunder. The early followers of Jesus move on. They choose Matthias to replace Judas, yes, but they don't spend much time discussing the man himself. It's as if once Judas vanishes from the stage, everyone collectively agrees to look away. Why not wrestle with his motives, warn others about his betrayal, or use his story to bolster their own authority? Why does Peter, always ready with a sword or a sermon, not give a single passionate rebuke against Judas by name? Why does Paul, who writes thousands of words dissecting the Christian message, who debates theology with everyone from Jerusalem to Athens, never mention him at all? It's almost eerie. The greatest villain in the founding story of Christianity. And no one seems particularly interested in talking about him. Not at first. Not while memories were fresh. Not while witnesses were still alive. That silence might be the loudest evidence we have. Not of Judas's guilt, but of discomfort, of ambiguity, of something that couldn't be explained easily, and so wasn't explained at all. In the early decades after Jesus' death, the first followers were scrambling to build something coherent out of what had just happened. They were persecuted, scattered, traumatized. They argued over theology, authority, Jewish law, and the very nature of who Jesus had been. Was he divine from birth? Was he raised bodily or spiritually? Did Gentiles need to become Jews to follow him? These were hotly debated and documented. But Judas not worth a footnote. Unless, of course, the story was still forming, and no one quite knew what to do with him. It's in this silence that suspicion begins to flicker. The canonical Gospels weren't written immediately. They evolved over decades. Mark, the earliest, leaves many questions open. Matthew expands the narrative. Luke adds details. John, the most theological, leans fully into cosmic symbolism. And with each version, Judas's villainy becomes more pronounced. By the time we reach John, he's not just the betrayer, he's a thief, a devil, a man into whom Satan enters. That kind of escalation doesn't come from fresh memory. It comes from narrative necessity. Someone needed to be the traitor. But the earliest disciples may have remembered Judas differently, may have understood something that the writers decades later needed to obscure. Perhaps it was easier to be silent than to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. That Judas wasn't the outsider. He wasn't the schemer. He was one of them. Still is, technically. In some early Christian sects, those labeled heretical by the orthodoxy that would later win Judas, wasn't even viewed negatively. He was seen as a necessary instrument, the one who completed the circle. And in that light, the disciples' silence becomes less suspicious and more reverent. A kind of hush that follows a sacred moment too complicated to explain. There's also the possibility that the silence was tactical. The fledgling movement needed unity. Infighting contradictions, unresolved tensions, these were luxuries they couldn't afford. So Judas becomes an archetype, not a memory. The writers give him a role, assign him a motive, and move on. The real man, whoever he was, fades into the shadows, and maybe that's where he wanted to be. You can imagine Judas watching the others scatter after the arrest, slipping into alleys and back rooms trying to make sense of what just happened. Peter denying, Thomas doubting, John weeping. And Judas, where is he? The Gospels offer two contradictory deaths. One says he returned the silver and hanged himself. Another says he fell burst open in a field. The details are gruesome, inconsistent. It feels like an attempt to overwrite something that didn't fit. Perhaps his fate was something else entirely. Perhaps he lived in exile carrying the burden of obedience that looked like sin. Perhaps he was silenced, not just by shame, but by fear. Fear that his version of the story would fracture the already fragile structure being built in Jesus' name. There's a haunting beauty in that possibility, that Judas chose not to defend himself, that he let the silence grow like a shadow stretching across the early church, because the truth, whatever it was, would have hurt too much to say aloud. And you begin to wonder what stories are lost in that silence. What truths buried beneath centuries of theological edits, political agendas, and well-meaning simplifications. The disciples never said much about Judas, but maybe their quiet was the most human reaction of all. Not anger, not rejection, just sorrow, and memory too painful to speak. History is written by the victors, or in this case, by the editors. And once the story of Jesus began to circulate in letter scrolls and whispered accounts, it didn't take long before the red pens came out. Not literal red pens, of course, those hadn't been invented yet. But scribes, theologians, and bishops with agendas sharp enough to slice entire gospels clean out of memory. And nowhere is this editorial bloodletting more apparent than in the treatment of Judas. The 4 canonical Gospels don't agree on everything, not even close. From Jesus' genealogy to his last words on the cross, the accounts differ. But one detail they all include with increasing intensity is Judas. Yet even here, contradictions bubble beneath the surface. In Matthew, Judas is repentant. In John, he's practically demonic. In Luke, Satan himself enters him just to be sure we get the point. It's almost as if, over time, the writers needed Judas to become more clearly villainous, less ambiguous, more useful. This didn't happen in a vacuum. The early church was under pressure internally and externally. Competing sects were spinning their own gospels, their own visions of Christ. The Gnostics in particular posed a unique threat. They offered a Jesus who revealed secret knowledge rather than demanded public faith. A Jesus who laughed at those who misunderstood. A Jesus who confided in Judas, not Peter. And that couldn't stand. So the gospel edits began. Not just deletions, but embellishments. Words sharpened, motives assigned, scenes constructed for effect. You can track the evolution like footprints in wet sand. The earliest version of the Last Supper is sparse. By the time John writes, Judas is already a thief, and Satan is waiting in the wings. It's a literary escalation, and one that points to deep anxiety, not about Judas himself, but about control. Control of the story, control of the meaning, control of who gets to stand closest to Jesus when history remembers. There were dozens of Gospels circulating in the first few centuries: Thomas, Philip, Mary, Truth, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, and yes, Judas. Some were poetic, some cryptic, some downright bizarre. But they all shared one thing: they told different stories, or at least different versions of the same events. In many of these, Judas wasn't the betrayer. He was the one Jesus trusted with the hardest truth, that the crucifixion had to happen, and someone had to make it happen. The Gospel of Judas, rediscovered centuries later, reads like a final rebuttal to the canon. In it, Jesus mocks the other disciples for their ignorance. He laughs at their rituals, their worship of false gods. But with Judas, he speaks clearly, gives him visions, shows him the architecture of heaven. It's deeply Gnostic, yes, full of cosmology and shimmering spirits, but it's also deeply human. A teacher giving his hardest lesson to the only student ready to receive it. You can imagine the church's reaction to such a gospel in the 2nd century: absolute panic. Because if that version spread, if people began to see Judas not as the traitor, but as the enlightened one, the entire hierarchy of sin and redemption might unravel. And so the edits continued, councils convened, texts were sifted, sorted, silenced. Some were burned, others hidden, And slowly, over decades, the canon congealed into the four Gospels we know today. It wasn't a grand conspiracy, not entirely. It was more like erosion, the steady shaping of a narrative to fit the needs of a growing institution. A Judas who was necessary to the story's mechanics, too ambiguous. A Judas who acted on Jesus' orders, too dangerous. Better to make him the greedy betrayer. Easier to preach. Easier to condemn. And the edits didn't stop with the text. They bled into art, into liturgy, into culture. Judas becomes the face of betrayal, of deceit. His features take on anti-Semitic overtones in medieval Europe, a tragedy that would ripple into horrors centuries later. His name becomes synonymous with treason. Children are taught to revile him before they can read. But in the margins, in the fragments, in the whispers of forbidden texts, a different Judas persists. Not saint, not hero, but something more complex. A man caught between obedience and condemnation. A man whose story was edited by people who needed clarity more than truth. You begin to feel how carefully sculpted the narrative has become. Not just for Judas, but for all of it. The gospel edit wars weren't about lies versus truth. They were about dominance versus diversity. And Judas, the most enigmatic of disciples, was their greatest casualty. What might the story have been if all the Gospels had survived? If the Church had embraced a plurality of voices instead of one tidy canon? If Judas had been allowed to speak in full, not just in footnotes and fragments, perhaps we'd see him not as the villain, but as the vessel. The one who took on the role no one else would, so that the rest could believe in a clean, simple ending. And perhaps the edits weren't mistakes, but choices made to preserve faith at the cost of nuance. Either way, the ink is dry now, but the truth, like water, has a habit of soaking through. Somewhere around the year 180 CE, a man named Irenaeus sat down to write a book that would shape the next 2 millennia of Christian thought. It was called Against Heresies, which you'll notice is not exactly subtle. He wasn't interested in a casual conversation about alternative ideas. He wanted to crush them. And near the top of his list, the secret texts, the ones whispered in back rooms and passed in secret between thinkers who weren't interested in institutional power. Irenaeus was a bishop, a theologian, and depending on how you view him, either the defender of orthodoxy or the first great censor. He believed in a singular truth, one Jesus, one church, one set of teachings. And to defend that vision, he needed villains. The Gnostics provided plenty. So did the Valentinians, the Marcionites, the Abionites. But one text in particular appears to have truly unsettled him, the Gospel of Judas. Now, to be clear, Irenaeus doesn't quote the Gospel of Judas directly, but in Against Heresies, he makes reference to a group of Christians, possibly the Cainites, who revered Judas as the only disciple who understood Jesus' true message. According to Irenaeus, these groups taught that all the biblical villains, Cain, Esau, Korah, Judas, were actually misunderstood heroes. They had seen the illusion for what it was. And in that worldview, Judas wasn't evil, he was essential. To Irenaeus, this wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Heresy wasn't simply theological error, it was infection. And like any good immune system, the early church responded by attacking. Books were banned, teachings were condemned. And slowly, the alternative voices, including those that told a different story about Judas, were silenced. But silence is a funny thing. It tends to preserve what noise would have destroyed. You can almost picture Irenaeus reading these secret texts, heart-pounding not with righteous fury, but with a flicker of fear, because some of the ideas weren't just bizarre, they were compelling. What if the material world was flawed? What if salvation required knowledge, not obedience? What if the crucifixion wasn't a tragedy but a planned release? And worst of all, what if the traitor had been the truest follower? The problem with Gnostic thought from the Church's perspective wasn't that it contradicted Scripture. It was that it competed with it. It offered an entirely different system, one where divine knowledge was internal, where salvation wasn't handed down by priests but awakened within. And in that system, figures like Judas weren't condemned, they were honored. And so Irenaeus began drawing lines. This gospel was approved. That one was heretical. These teachings were acceptable. Those were poison. And with each stroke of his pen, he narrowed the path of orthodoxy. We like to imagine that the Bible came together by divine guidance, but the truth is far messier. It was people like Irenaeus, devout, intelligent, and deeply human, who shaped it. And in doing so, they shaped Judas too. No longer a disciple with agency and intimacy, but a caricature, a warning sign, a theological scapegoat. But there's irony here, because Irenaeus's writing, intended to crush the heresies, preserved their memory. His descriptions are sometimes the only surviving mentions of these lost gospels. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of the Egyptians, he hated them. But he told us they existed. And that's how we knew what to look for when the desert finally coughed them up again. The fragments we've recovered tell a different story. In them, Judas is not possessed but chosen, not greedy but obedient. And that story was dangerous because it allowed for complexity. It allowed for the possibility that God's plan might look like betrayal to the untrained eye. And that terrified men like Irenaeus, because once you admit that the whole structure begins to wobble. Who decides what's truth? Who decides what's holy? If Judas acted on divine instruction, then sin becomes a question of perspective. And perspective is hard to control. So he wrote, and he warned, and he canonized. Not just Scripture, but Judas himself cast in bronze as the eternal betrayer. But you begin to feel the edges fraying, because for Irenaeus to work so hard to erase a story, he had to believe it had power. No one burns a book they don't fear. No one writes 5 volumes against an idea they find harmless. And so the image of Judas lingers not just in Scripture, but in the margins, the footnotes, the redacted passages. A man erased so thoroughly that the Church had to keep reminding people of what he supposedly did. Maybe Irenaeus won the battle, but the war, if you could call it that, wasn't over. Because you're here now listening, reading between the lines, peeling back the edits, and somewhere beneath the layers of doctrine and denunciation, a voice is starting to emerge. Not the voice of the Church, but the voice of the disciple who dared to do what none of the others could. The sands around the Dead Sea are quiet now, whispering only when the wind stirs their edges. But in 1947, those dunes gave up a secret one that changed everything. A young Bedouin boy tossed a stone into a cave and heard pottery shatter. What he found inside weren't coins or relics, but scrolls, brittle rolled-up skins of ink and parchment that would take decades to decipher. And among those ancient words, tucked in the writings of an apocalyptic sect known as the Essenes, scholars began to sense a strange vibration, something echoing through time, something that seemed to hum in harmony with the forbidden Gospel of Judas. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Judas by name. They predate the Gospel narratives as we know them. But what they do reveal is a worldview that feels uncannily familiar. A battle between light and darkness, a hidden knowledge passed only to the worthy, and a sense of divine destiny unfolding not with triumph, but with tragic necessity. In that context, Judas begins to look less like a traitor and more like a figure written into a prophecy. The Essenes, the group most likely responsible for the scrolls, were not your average believers. They lived in isolation, obsessed with purity, ritual, and eschatology. They saw the world in dualities: good versus evil, truth versus deception, sons of light versus sons of darkness. Their texts are filled with cryptic references to a teacher of righteousness and a wicked priest. And while scholars have long debated who these titles refer to, the structure is hauntingly familiar: a chosen one, a betrayal, a fall, and a divine plan misunderstood by the masses. In this lens, Judas takes on a new dimension. He becomes the archetypal wicked priest, not evil by nature, but playing the necessary role in a drama written by forces greater than himself. Or more provocatively, he could be the true teacher of righteousness, falsely vilified by those who didn't understand his insight. It's unsettling, of course. But the echoes between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of Judas grow louder the longer you listen. Take, for example, the obsession with hidden wisdom. The Essenes believed that true knowledge of God was reserved for the initiated. Sound familiar? The Gospel of Judas follows that very pattern, with Jesus dismissing the other disciples and offering Judas alone the real explanation behind creation and divinity. Both traditions are allergic to superficial faith. They demand depth, sacrifice, comprehension. And both suggest that the path to salvation runs through darkness, not around it. Even more startling are the shared cosmologies. The scrolls describe a layered universe filled with angels, thrones, and archons, spiritual beings that govern different realms. In one text, the war of the sons of light. Against the sons of darkness, the battle isn't just physical, but metaphysical. You can almost hear the Gospel of Judas whispering in reply, describing how Judas alone understands the nature of these invisible forces. How he alone sees that Jesus' death is not a tragedy, but an ascent, a return to the realm of the imperishable. And then there's the tone: cold, mournful, inevitable. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't paint their vision of history with joy. They see suffering as the price of awakening, as if truth demands betrayal, sacrifice, and exile. And again, you find Judas there, not smiling, not smirking, but resolute. A man who knew what he was doing and did it anyway. Of course, none of this is conclusive. The scrolls don't hand us a signed confession or a theological roadmap, but they do suggest that by the time Jesus was walking the earth, the air was already thick with ideas about divine plans, chosen ones, secret wisdom, and necessary betrayals. Judas didn't invent the role he played. He may have simply stepped into it, guided not by greed, but by something far older. Some scholars even propose that the Gospel of Judas may have drawn directly from the same traditions that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. That the metaphysical vocabulary, archons, aeons, luminous clouds, wasn't new but inherited. Passed down through mystic schools, filtered through sects like the Essenes, and crystallized in the Gospels we were never supposed to read. And you begin to see the outline of something uncomfortable. Not a conspiracy, but a pattern. The early followers of Jesus weren't inventing their theology in a vacuum. They were swimming in a sea of ancient ideas, many of them apocalyptic, many of them dualistic, and many of them skeptical of simple good versus evil narratives. In that sea, Judas wasn't a monster. He was a mirror, a vessel for ideas that couldn't survive institutional theology. Because the church needed clarity, needed rules, needed villains. But the scrolls, they didn't flinch from ambiguity. They embraced it. So the next time you picture Judas in that moonlit garden, think of the caves near the Dead Sea. Think of the scrolls that sat in silence for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to read between the lines. Maybe the betrayal wasn't a fall, but a fulfillment. A quiet pact between teacher and student, echoing a cosmic truth: that had been whispered long before either of them were born. The Essenes were always a bit different. Not warriors, not Pharisees, not Sadducees. They lived apart in the cliffs above the Dead Sea and the deserts beyond Jerusalem in communes that worshipped not with blood sacrifice but with silence, purity, and scrolls. And though the Gospels never mention them by name, their shadow hangs over every page of early Christian history, especially when it comes to Judas. It's easy to assume Judas was just a wayward disciple, a man seduced by silver or soured by disappointment. But what if he wasn't just a misfit? What if he came from a tradition entirely separate from the other 11? What if Judas was an Essene? There's no proof, of course. No dusty manuscript labeled property of Judas Iscariot Essene, apprentice. But the circumstantial clues are strangely persuasive. The Essenes were obsessed with cosmic dualism, light and darkness, truth and deceit, sacred timing. They believed in an ultimate teacher, the Moreh ha-Tzedek, or teacher of righteousness, and a traitor who would oppose him. Sound familiar? In some of their writings, the teacher is betrayed by someone close. Not a foreign enemy, but a fellow member. A trusted figure. The Essenes' world was built on the idea that knowledge, not blood, defined loyalty, and that sometimes betrayal was part of a divine test. That kind of thinking feels eerily resonant with what the Gospel of Judas suggests, that Judas was chosen, not corrupted. That he was trusted with the hardest role, the necessary rupture. Even the daily life of the Essenes aligns with some of what we know about Judas. They valued secrecy. They lived communally. They rejected the temple's corruption much like Jesus did. And they practiced ritual meals shared with symbolic meaning. If Judas had once belonged to that world, his decision to break from the 12 or fulfill an unspoken agreement would not have felt like betrayal. It would have felt like prophecy. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, though fragmented, offer tantalizing clues. One text describes a man of the lie who opposes the teacher only for that teacher's message to eventually triumph. Others speak of an elect who will suffer not because they sinned, but because the world cannot understand their righteousness. These figures are not painted with simple brushstrokes. They are complex, ambiguous, haunting. Just like Judas. Imagine for a moment a young Judas trained among the Essenes, raised to see the world as a spiritual battlefield where physical life is fleeting and the soul's journey is all that matters. Imagine him hearing the words of Jesus and recognizing them, not as new revelations, but as the fulfillment of ideas already whispered to him in the caves above Qumran. That would make him more than a disciple. It would make him a believer with a roadmap, someone who had been waiting for this moment all his life. It would also make him dangerous. The other disciples, fishermen and tax collectors, heard parables and saw miracles. But Judas, he might have seen patterns, structures, cosmic symmetry. And when Jesus began to speak of sacrifice, of glorification through death, Judas would not have been shocked. He would have nodded. Quietly, resigned. In that context, the kiss in Gethsemane becomes almost ceremonial, a ritual signal, the completion of a long, spiraling plan that began not in Galilee but in the scrolls of the desert. There are even linguistic clues that bind the traditions. The Essenes often use terms like sons of light, sons of darkness, and rulers of the aeons, language that shows up again in the Gospel of Judas. And the idea that Jesus would be delivered by one who understood, not one who simply failed, fits seamlessly with the sect's view of divine mystery. Of course, such theories are speculative, but so is nearly everything about Judas. The Gospels don't give us his thoughts. They don't trace his lineage. He's a cipher empty enough to fill with whatever narrative you need, And perhaps that's what the early church feared most, that Judas might have come from a deeper tradition, one harder to condemn and even harder to control. Because if Judas was insane or influenced by their teachings, then he didn't act out of malice. He acted from conviction. And that changes everything. It means the betrayal wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, accepted, necessary, a fulfillment of sacred duty. And if the teacher asked for it, then Judas obeyed. You begin to see how the mystery deepens, how the lines blur. The desert scrolls, the secret sects, the rituals lost to time. Judas walks among them like a figure out of legend, misunderstood, not because he lied, but because he told the truth too early. And history, as always, punished the one who broke the script. The story goes that Jesus was arrested, tried, crucified, and buried, and that Judas was the one who made it all happen. But something about that sequence always felt a little too clean, too convenient, as if the betrayal was a twist in the plot, not part of the plan. Yet the more you listen, really listen to the words buried inside the Gospels and the Apocrypha, the more another possibility takes shape, that Judas didn't cause the crucifixion. He executed it. There's a quiet tension running beneath the Last Supper. Jesus doesn't seem surprised. He breaks bread. He speaks of sacrifice. He tells the disciples that one among them will betray him, but his tone isn't angry. It's almost resolved. Then he turns to Judas, and in what might be the calmest line in the entire New Testament says, "What you are about to do, do quickly." It doesn't sound like someone blindsided by betrayal. It sounds like someone giving permission. In the Gospel of Judas, the scene becomes even more explicit. Jesus tells Judas, not in secret shame, but in quiet clarity, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." That phrase, haunting and strange, suggests a deep separation between the physical and the divine. The man is just a garment. The spirit, the real self, will pass through untouched. In this vision, Judas is not a betrayer. He's a midwife to transcendence. The idea that the crucifixion was preordained isn't controversial. Even the canonical Gospels suggest it repeatedly. Jesus speaks of his death as a necessity, a cup he must drink, a road he must walk. So if the event was an inevitable part of divine orchestration, then someone had to set it in motion. And if you trust Jesus' wisdom, then surely he wouldn't have left such a critical hinge point to chance. So why not entrust it to Judas, the one who asked the hard questions, the one who watched closely, the one who in some texts understood the paradox of death as liberation? It reframes everything. Judas doesn't approach the priests with a smirk and a coin pouch. He goes as an agent of inevitability. Not because he despised Jesus, but because he trusted him. Trusted that what they were doing mattered. Trusted that what followed would not be the end, but the unlocking of something hidden. There are echoes of this logic in other faith traditions. In Islam, for instance, many believe Jesus was not crucified at all, that another took his place, or that the crucifixion was an illusion. In that interpretation, Judas either switches places with Jesus or is misidentified, depending on the school of thought. Either way, the event is depicted as divine sleight of hand, suggesting once again that appearances can be deceiving. But in Christian texts especially, the non-canonical ones, it's Judas who seems to glimpse the full picture. He sees that the death of Jesus isn't a tragedy. It's a necessity, a gateway, the kind of thing that only a true follower would help fulfill. And this is where the discomfort sets in. Because if Judas acted with knowledge, with consent, even then, the entire moral structure of the passion begins to tilt. If the crucifixion was meant to happen, then condemning the one who enabled it feels disingenuous, like punishing the stagehand who dropped the curtain on cue. It's not a comfortable theory. It removes the easy villain. It complicates the clean division between good and evil. But the scriptures themselves seem to invite this complexity. They hint, they contradict, they double back on themselves in ways that suggest something deeper, something intentional. Take the book of Acts. Peter speaks of the crucifixion as something that happened according to God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. That doesn't sound like betrayal. That sounds like choreography. Even Jesus' tone after the resurrection shifts. There's no trace of bitterness toward Judas, no divine rebuke, no fire from heaven. He appears to his disciples, he comforts, he explains, but Judas is simply gone, removed from the stage not because he failed, but because his part was finished. And what a part it was, to bear the guilt, to wear the blame, to be remembered not as the obedient one, but as the traitor for thousands of years. That's a level of narrative exile rarely granted in religious history, and yet something in that silence feels intentional. As if Judas was meant to vanish from the story so that it could take on its proper shape. But maybe now, as buried texts resurface and the ancient noise begins to hum again, it's time to ask the question with open eyes. Did Judas know? Did he carry out the crucifixion, not as a crime, but as a commission? Did he step into the garden that night with shaking hands, not because he was evil, but because he was faithful to a plan that only he and his teacher fully understood? If so, then the word betrayal loses its edge, and in its place rises something much harder to grasp, but infinitely more human. A sacrifice within a sacrifice. The friend who did the hardest thing for the sake of love. Words are slippery things. They carry meanings, yes, but they also carry momentum. The moment Judas kissed Jesus in the garden, the word betrayal attached itself like a burr. But what if that word was wrong, or more precisely, what if it was replaced? What if betrayal wasn't the original intention, but a later insertion? A semantic shift that took root and never let go. There's an old rabbinic idea that the precise words matter less than the direction of the message. You feel it in the flow of Hebrew poetry, in the cadence of oral teaching. But once the texts of the early church moved into Greek Latin, and eventually the vernacular tongues of Europe, things began to harden. Words became law. Definitions became dogma. And one word in particular was destined to take center stage. The Greek term used for Judas's act is paradidomai, usually translated as to betray. But here's the twist. That same word can also mean to hand over, to deliver, or to entrust. It's used dozens of times across the New Testament. Jesus is said to be handed over to the authorities. Paul writes that he delivered the gospel he received. Even God is described as having delivered up his own Son. The same root, the same action. The difference, context, intent, and perhaps most critically, agenda. If paradidomi simply means to hand over, then Judas's action loses its venom. It becomes something neutral, mechanical even. A transfer, a passage. But when the Gospels were being shaped by communities under siege, by leaders trying to define who was in and who was out, neutrality was a luxury they couldn't afford. They needed a villain, a contrast to the hero. And so handing over became betraying. The shift wasn't just linguistic, it was theological. It allowed the crucifixion to be painted as an act of cosmic injustice, a blameless lamb betrayed by a faithless friend. The narrative needed pathos. It needed drama. And one Greek verb twisted just so provided both. But what if the act was never meant to be framed that way? What if Judas entrusted Jesus to the process not out of treachery, but obedience? The Gospel of Judas, after all, frames the entire act as cooperation. Jesus chooses Judas, instructs him, confides in him, tells him that he will exceed all of them. There's no trace of condemnation, just sorrow, just inevitability. It's not hard to imagine how this might have looked in the earliest Christian communities, those still figuring out who they were and what they believed. Some may have viewed Judas not as a cautionary tale, but as a tragic hero. The one who did what no one else could. The one who accepted the role of the hander-over because someone had to. But the word betrayed him. By the time Latin translations emerged, tradidit became the dominant form, a term even more firmly rooted in the idea of treason. And from there, the story calcified. Judas was no longer the disciple who completed the plan. He was the one who broke it. And for that, he became the face of all betrayal in art, in literature, in theology. It's tempting to view this as merely a translation error, an innocent mistake. But words don't travel alone. They carry baggage. And in this case, the semantic shift from handed over to betrayed shaped centuries of sermons, creeds, and condemnations. You can see the consequences ripple outward. Entire medieval plays centered around Judas's treachery. Artists gave him twisted features, darker skin, and animalistic eyes. His name became an insult, a shorthand for treason. And through it all, the original verb quietly sat in the text, waiting to be noticed. There's something almost tragic about it. That a man's legacy could hinge on a word. That history's most infamous traitor might have been, linguistically speaking, misfiled. But there's also hope in that realization, because if the narrative of betrayal was built on a semantic misstep, then maybe it can be unbuilt. Maybe the path back to understanding Judas begins not with exoneration, but with translation. With reading the same word paradidomi and asking what if it meant something else. It's a gentle unraveling, a soft tug at the seam, and once you start, the threads begin to loosen. The kiss, the silver, the silence of the disciples, the supposed suicide. All of it begins to blur just slightly. Not enough to erase, just enough to suggest there's more beneath the surface. And suddenly Judas isn't just a character in a drama. He's a linguistic casualty. A man handed over not just Jesus, but his own legacy to the machinery of history. The word betrayed him, and the world followed. When you hear the word demon, a certain image likely flickers to life: red skin, horns, fire. But in the ancient world, particularly in Greek, the term was far more ambiguous. Daimon didn't mean devil, it meant spirit, an invisible force that moved between gods and men, sometimes guiding, sometimes tempting, always hovering in the background of fate. Socrates spoke of his daimonion not as an evil voice, but as a divine whisper of conscience. So when early Christian texts began to associate Judas with a daemon, it wasn't necessarily the insult it would later become. And yet somewhere in the layers of translation and theology, the nuance disappeared. Judas didn't just become a traitor, he became possessed, taken over, puppeted by darkness. Luke's gospel tells us plainly, then Satan entered into Judas. A chilling line, brief and brutal. But what did that mean to the original readers? What did Satan mean to first-century Jews? And more curiously, what did daemon mean to the Greek-speaking communities that first copied and spread these texts? In the fluid cosmology of the early Mediterranean world, daemons were not monsters. They were intermediaries, spirits that delivered messages from the divine. Some were benevolent, some malevolent, most simply necessary. They existed within a framework that didn't divide the spiritual realm into tidy boxes labeled good and evil, That sharp dualism came later shaped by theology politics and centuries of doctrinal cleanup. So if Judas was described in spiritual terms as influenced by or acting under the weight of a daemon, then it's worth asking, was he chosen or overtaken? Was he invaded by darkness or filled with divine purpose? There are threads in early Christian mysticism, threads quickly snipped by orthodoxy, that suggest Judas acted as a divine agent, not a moral failure. In these rarefied circles, demonic influence wasn't synonymous with corruption. It meant intensity, vision, a soul acting under compulsion too vast for human logic. Judas becomes not the pawn of Satan, but the embodiment of necessary sacrifice, a chosen vessel who bore the unbearable. And that interpretation begins to make unsettling sense. If Jesus needed someone to carry the unbearable weight of the crucifixion's trigger, wouldn't it have to be someone close, someone both human and set apart? A man not unlike the daemons themselves, not divine, not mortal, but existing in a liminal space. Judas begins to look less like a man possessed and more like a man charged. Later, theologians would try to tidy it all up. Augustine Aquinas, the great systematizers of sin and grace, they needed clean categories. Satan had to be evil. Judas had to be damned. Daemons were rebranded as demons, stripped of their nuance, and marched into hell to keep the narrative sharp-edged. But the original language resists such clarity. It whispers of complexity, of moral inversion, of a world where even the darkest acts might hold sacred resonance. And that ambiguity carries weight. If Judas was a daimonic figure, then his presence at the end of Jesus' life isn't accidental, it's structural. He doesn't interrupt the story, he completes it. He moves within it like a spirit summoned by the story itself. Not evil, not good, just inevitable. There's an old mystical idea that the divine sometimes hides itself within contradiction, that the greatest truths appear where opposites meet, light within shadow, order within chaos. And if you follow that idea far enough, Judas becomes more than a villain. He becomes a paradox incarnate, a man cursed by history, but perhaps blessed by destiny. The term daemon, when spoken aloud in an ancient Greek marketplace, wouldn't have inspired fear. It might have inspired respect, wariness, curiosity. And maybe that's how Judas should be seen, not with hatred, but with wary reverence, as someone who stepped into a role no one else could bear. Because someone had to do it. Someone had to walk beside Jesus, understand him deeply, and then do what the others could not. Someone had to bear the hatred of generations, the misunderstanding, the sermons, and the stained glass, and the scorn. Judas took it all. And if the early texts whisper even a hint of daimonic calling, then maybe that burden was the point. So when you hear the phrase, Satan entered into Judas, ask yourself what spirit really moved him. Was it darkness, or was it duty disguised as doom? The answer, like the old meanings of old words, resists the clarity we crave. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the truth of Judas was never meant to be easy. Two stories, both about the end, both about Judas. And neither quite adds up. In one version, the one most people remember, Judas throws the silver on the temple floor, overcome with guilt. He runs off and hangs himself. That's from Matthew. A grim, poetic justice. The betrayer destroyed by his own conscience. But then there's another version, quieter but stranger. In the book of Acts, Judas doesn't hang himself. He buys a field, he falls, his body bursts open, his innards spill out. Not exactly the kind of story you hear at Sunday school. The contradiction has baffled scholars for centuries. Did he hang? Did he fall? Was the field cursed? Did he even die at all? Or are we looking at something else, something darker than suicide and harder to prove? Was Judas silenced? That theory doesn't come from conspiracy theorists. It comes from reading between the lines. Because when someone leaves a movement, especially in its early fragile stages, and especially under mysterious circumstances, their fate becomes useful. It becomes a lesson, a symbol, a way to point the finger without letting people ask too many questions. You have to imagine how Judas's presence might have disrupted the story. Imagine him surviving. Imagine him telling his side. Jesus asked me to do it, he says. It was part of the plan. Imagine that unraveling through a movement built on clean dichotomies, good versus evil, savior versus traitor. The crucifixion needed clarity, a villain, a scapegoat. But a living Judas, quiet, sorrowful, maybe even insisting he had obeyed, wouldn't offer that clarity. He'd offer confusion, complication, and movements, especially religious ones, rarely welcome that. So what if his death was managed? There's a long, grim tradition of eliminating those who know too much. Heretics, apostates, dangerous insiders. The early church wouldn't have needed to send assassins, but it wouldn't have needed to preserve his reputation either. The field could have been purchased in his name. A story could have been constructed, one that tied up the loose end with the neat bow of divine punishment. And even if Judas did take his own life, there's still a tragedy we rarely speak aloud. What if he did it because he believed he had fulfilled his role and still became the villain? Imagine that despair. Imagine believing you acted on divine instruction, obeyed your teacher's most difficult command, and then realized no one else understood, that they'd never understand, that history was already moving without you. You're not a hero. You're a monster. Your name, your face, your memory, all rotting in the eyes of the people you once called brothers. That level of isolation isn't just emotional. It's cosmic. It's mythic. And it might explain why Judas vanishes so quickly from every early account. One moment he's sitting at the table dipping bread into the same bowl as Jesus. The next, he's gone, replaced, not by another man, but by legend. The kind of legend that grows thorns. His name is never used for children. His legacy is painted with devils and shadows. And yet, there's a hole in the story. A quiet, echoing space where his voice should have been. If he was so guilty, so wicked, so spiritually doomed, why don't the other disciples talk about it? Why no great denunciations? Why no epistles warning believers to beware the spirit of Judas? Instead, there's just silence. The kind that doesn't follow justice but erasure. And maybe that's what hurts most. That if Judas did die by his own hand, it wasn't just guilt. It was grief. Not at having betrayed his master, but at having carried out what he believed was necessary, only to be misunderstood forever. In medieval mystery, plays Judas's rope becomes a stage prop. Audiences cheer. The villain gets what he deserves. But it's all based on an assumption that Judas betrayed for no reason but greed, that his fate was fair, that his death was divine justice. But if the story is different, if the Gospel of Judas is even partly true, then that rope isn't justice, it's tragedy, the ending of a man who obeyed and was discarded, not because he failed, but because he succeeded in a role too heavy for the world to bear. The body hangs, or falls, or disappears. The field is bought. The name changes, Akeldama, the field of blood, and history walks away, wiping its hands. But the question lingers. Did Judas die because he betrayed Jesus, or because he fulfilled something too sacred to survive? History may have written Judas in words, but art sealed his fate in images. Before children could read, They could recognize him. Always on the edge of the frame, cloaked in shadow, reaching for silver, leaning in for the kiss. If the Gospels condemned him in verses, painters immortalized him in brushstrokes, and the damage was irreversible. In Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, each disciple reacts in a burst of drama as Jesus announces that one will betray him. Judas is the only one in shadow. His hand clutches a money pouch. His face, cast slightly away from the light, has an edge of suspicion. It's brilliant storytelling. But it's also coded judgment. Judas is no longer simply present, he is marked. That visual language repeats over and over. In medieval manuscripts, Judas is often drawn with red hair, a trait associated with deceit. In later European works, his features become exaggerated, sometimes bordering on caricature, sometimes overtly anti-Semitic. His nose lengthens, his posture hunches, his eyes narrow. Betrayal, it seems, required a visual identity, one that generations of artists were more than happy to provide. But dig deeper, and something stranger appears. In early Christian art, the kind still clinging to the catacombs, hidden in the flickering light of Roman persecution, Judas is often indistinguishable from the others. 12 men, 12 halos, no pouches, no red hair. The betrayal hasn't yet become a morality tale. It hasn't crystallized into villainy. It's only later, when the church gains power, when theology hardens, that Judas begins to deform on canvas. And as theology simplifies, so too does his depiction. He becomes grotesque, not just in deed, but in body, a symbol, a warning, a scapegoat drawn into being over and over. And yet in the margins and the shadows of altarpieces, in the details too small for sermons, alternative images sneak through. A few rare frescoes in Eastern churches depict Judas with a softer expression. Some show him close to Jesus, not recoiling, but leaning in. In certain Byzantine icons, he's not visibly separate at all. No pouch, no glare, no cartoonish sneer. He's just one of them. And then there's the art that hides him entirely. Scenes of the Last Supper with only 11 disciples, as if removing him would purify the memory. But absence is a statement too. And when Judas disappears, the narrative becomes incomplete, sterile. You feel the loss, even if you can't name it. The Gospel of Judas, with all its scandalous whispers, has almost no artistic tradition, likely because its message was buried along with the text itself. But imagine what that imagery might have looked like. Judas and Jesus alone under starlight. A gesture not of betrayal, but of parting. A disciple receiving a secret, his face torn between awe and dread. Not a villain, a vessel. That art doesn't exist yet, but it might. Now that the gospel has resurfaced, now that silence is cracking, perhaps a new visual language will emerge. One that reclaims Judas not as a cautionary tale, but as a tragic figure, complicated, conflicted, essential. Because visual symbols don't just reflect belief, they shape it. For centuries, Christians learned who Judas was not from Scripture, but from stained glass, from murals, from passion plays. They saw the darkness and never questioned its source. But symbols can be reclaimed. Consider the circle of the Last Supper. Jesus in the center, flanked by those who would abandon, deny, and doubt him, not just Judas. And yet only one bears the curse. Only one wears the symbol of betrayal like a brand. It's as if the others were allowed to be human, and Judas was not. You start to wonder what it means to be the one holding the purse, the one closest to the teacher's side, the one who left the room before the others even understood what was happening. Judas moves through the visual record like a ghost, framed, accused, but rarely explored. There's something poetic in that. He is seen but never truly looked at, painted but not understood. Perhaps that's the fate of those who bear the unbearable, the ones who do what others can't, the ones who act not out of hate, but out of calling. They become symbols before they can speak. And so Judas hangs on the walls of churches and museums not just as the betrayer, but as a canvas onto which fear, blame, and misunderstanding have been projected for 2,000 years. But art is never static. Shadows shift. Light moves. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for the image to change. Imagine the crucifixion has passed. The tomb is sealed. The disciples scatter, some hiding, some weeping, some already half drunk on the strange, stinging hope of resurrection. But not Judas. Judas is gone. Not just in body, but in memory. Removed. Erased. As if the story required him to vanish so the rest could continue. But what if he didn't disappear? In apocryphal traditions, those sidelined by orthodoxy, copied by hand in dim light, and passed in whispers, there are flickers of something else. Stories that claim Judas didn't die that night or the next, that he wandered preaching, not with fanfare but in exile. The cursed disciple carrying a secret too sacred to share and too dangerous to forget. One such whisper comes from the 2nd century text, the Acts of the Apostles, not the canonical one, but a later fragmentary retelling found in certain Gnostic circles. In it, there's mention of a doubled witness, a figure who walked among the caves of Galilee, speaking not of guilt, but of knowledge. The name is obscured as if the scribe was nervous to write it, but the timing fits, the tone fits, and the message, it's disturbingly familiar. This figure speaks of a sacrifice that was not a murder, but a door. He talks of Jesus asking him to play a part, to become the hinge upon which heaven and earth turned. And the people listening, they aren't outraged. They're afraid. Not because the man is lying, but because he might be telling the truth. Could this be Judas? It's impossible to say. But it opens a possibility rarely considered that Judas, far from ending his story with silver and rope, became a wandering voice in the wilderness. Not a preacher, not a prophet. Just a man trying to carry the unbearable weight of being right, in a world that had no room for him. There are parallels here with other exiles. Think of Cain, marked and cast out, or Aeneas wandering after the fall of Troy. These figures don't vanish, they survive, and in their survival they haunt. They become the echo after the thunder, the consequence that no one wants to acknowledge. The early church, scrambling to consolidate its message, would have had every reason to silence such a figure. A living Judas would be a theological landmine. If he spoke, what might he say? That he had no choice. That Jesus told him to do it. That he understood something the others never would. More than a threat to doctrine, he would be a threat to memory, to stability. Because if Judas didn't fall in shame, if he didn't kill himself in remorse, then every sermon about betrayal starts to wobble. And maybe that's why the image of him wandering is so compelling. Because it means he wasn't just a villain. He was a witness. Not to the crime, but to the cost. Some Coptic fragments from the 3rd century refer cryptically to a black-robed one who traveled from Judea to Egypt, speaking only at night, never entering cities, refusing bread except from children. He is described as weeping often, speaking slowly, and bearing the name he who was sent and returned. There's no direct link to Judas, no smoking scroll, but the atmosphere is thick with implication. And if that was him, if even part of that story is true, then Judas's role becomes even more tragic. Not just the man who obeyed, but the man who was cursed for it. Not just the one who acted, but the one who had to live with the consequences, without applause, without vindication, just silence. That's the part of the story that feels the most human. The aftermath, the ache, the need to be understood, and the terrible knowledge that you never will be. Imagine Judas standing on the edge of a desert, watching the dust of Jerusalem fade behind him, knowing the story was already shifting the roles already assigned, knowing that when people told it, they would call him traitor, not servant. They would remember the kiss, not the tears, the silver, not the silence. And yet, he walks. Not because he wants to escape, but because there's nothing left to explain. He did what he was asked. He played his part. And now the curtain has fallen, but the actor remains. There are no churches bearing his name, no feast days in his honor. But if the whispers are true, he walked the wilderness not in disgrace, but in mourning. A man too early for his own redemption. And in that image, quiet, exiled, grieving Judas becomes something more than a cautionary tale. He becomes a question that history never dared answer. Bethany, the quiet village just east of Jerusalem, a place where stories slowed, where friends lingered, and where the Gospels briefly exhaled. It was here in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus that Jesus found refuge. No grand sermons, no miracles for the crowds, just closeness. And perhaps if the apocryphal texts are to be believed, something else, secret teachings spoken softly after the others had gone to sleep. In the canonical Gospels, Bethany is where Jesus raised Lazarus, where he dined with the 12, where a woman anointed his feet with oil so precious it made the treasurer Judas object. But beyond these scenes lies a recurring tradition in non-canonical writings that Bethany was more than just a stop on the road to Jerusalem. It was a sanctuary of knowledge, a place where Jesus shared what he could not say in the temple or even in the upper room, and that the one who listened most closely was Judas. It's not a stretch. Judas was often quiet in the Gospels, observant, calculating, the one holding the coin purse and the questions. He may not have been the most emotionally expressive like Peter or the most beloved like John, but he was present, watchful. And in Bethany, where the atmosphere softened and the shadows lengthened, it's not hard to imagine Jesus pulling him aside. There's an ancient Syriac fragment, fragile and incomplete, that tells of a night in Bethany when Jesus spoke of the departure of light from flesh. It doesn't name Judas, but it mentions the one who stood at the door and heard. That phrase, so small, so specific, has sparked endless speculation. Was it Judas listening not as an intruder, but as a chosen witness? Was this the moment when the plan was fully revealed? In the Gospel of Judas, we know that Jesus shares cosmic truths with him, not the parables meant for the crowds, but something more unsettling. Visions of realms and rulers, aeons and stars, divine beings who do not always serve the good. And Judas, unlike the others, doesn't flinch. He doesn't ask for clarification. He listens, accepts. If those teachings began anywhere, Bethany is the likely stage. Removed from the crowds, beyond the reach of Roman ears and priestly spies, this small village became the quiet center of an earthquake no one heard, except perhaps one man. It's telling that the canonical Gospels place Judas's moment of betrayal just after the Bethany anointing. The narrative insists he was angry about the waste of perfume. But what if that was the cover story? What if what truly changed that night wasn't his greed, but his understanding? Imagine Jesus telling him, as the oil soaked into his skin, "It is time. You must do what they cannot. You must hand me over so I may rise." Imagine Judas walking into the night not as a traitor, but as a soldier with a terrible order. Bethany then becomes something sacred. Not just a village, but a threshold, a liminal place where Jesus passed on the truth not just of his death, but of its meaning. And in doing so may have handed that knowledge not to Peter or John or Mary, but to Judas. There's a long tradition in mystical teachings, not just Christian, but Sufi Kabbalistic Hermetic, that wisdom must be hidden. That some truths must be passed one to one, not because they are shameful, but because they are too potent. If the crucifixion was not an execution but a passage, if it was planned, deliberate, even chosen, then that truth would have needed a guardian, a keeper, someone who could hold it in silence until the time came. And silence, after all, is what Judas gave. Not once does he speak after the act, not in protest, not in justification. His last words, depending on which gospel you trust, are either a confession of sin or an echo of silence. But perhaps there was more, not written, not recorded, but remembered in the small places like Bethany. There's even a whisper in one early Coptic text of a book of the 12, a scroll said to contain the sayings of the Master as spoken to the last listener. The identity of that listener is lost, erased maybe, or perhaps never written at all. But in the rhythm of that phrase, last listener, a familiar shape emerges. Could it have been Judas? Could Bethany have been the site where knowledge passed from teacher to student, not in thunder but in breath? If so, then the betrayal was never betrayal. It was initiation. And Judas, far from falling from grace, stepped deeper into it, understanding what the others couldn't or wouldn't. Bethany still sits quietly today, nestled under the modern name Al-Azariah, place of Lazarus. The tomb is still there. The stones still sleep. But somewhere beneath them, perhaps, lies the echo of that night, when one man listened and understood too much. If Judas was the most vilified man in the Christian story, then Mary Magdalene was its most misrepresented woman. Their fates, though different in detail, follow a similar arc. Both were close to Jesus. Both were silenced. And both in the shadows of alternative gospels emerge not as traitor or prostitute, but as keepers of secret knowledge. Mirror images, one male, one female, erased, not for what they did, but for what they knew. The Gospel of Mary, a fragmentary text discovered in the late 19th century, presents a very different Mary than the one most people know. Not the penitent sinner, not the weeping mourner, but a leader, a confidant. The one who comforts the disciples after Jesus' departure and recounts teachings that the others never heard. Teachings about the soul's ascent, the illusion of matter, and the role of internal revelation, ideas strikingly similar to the Gnostic themes found in the Gospel of Judas. In that moment, Mary becomes more than a symbol. She becomes a rival to Peter. He challenges her, doesn't believe her. He says Jesus would never have shared such things with a woman. And yet Levi, another disciple, defends her. He reminds them that Jesus loved her more than them, that her insight deserves to be heard. It's a scene that echoes something uncomfortably familiar, a single disciple entrusted with teachings, too strange, too elevated, too other, met with resistance by those who stayed within the safe bounds of tradition. Replace Mary with Judas, and the mirror is complete. Both figures receive private instruction. Both are presented as closer to Jesus than the others. Both are treated with suspicion, not because they sinned, but because they knew too much. In the canonical narrative, Mary is eventually rehabilitated. She becomes the apostle to the apostles, the first witness of the resurrection. The Church, realizing her popularity and symbolic power, reshapes her image, from outcast to saint, from danger to devotion. Judas, however, receives no such redemption. His story ends in death, in shame, in sermons and moral lessons that paint him in colors darker than ink. But what if that was simply because he couldn't be assimilated? What if his knowledge, like Mary's, was just too disruptive? Consider the structure of suppression. Mary Magdalene was distorted into a sex worker. Judas was distilled into a devil, their humanity flattened, their insight buried. Because to accept their version of the story would mean rewriting everything. And perhaps that's the point. The Gospel of Mary, like the Gospel of Judas, emphasizes inward knowledge over external ritual. It challenges hierarchy. It values experience over dogma. In both texts, Jesus is less interested in founding a church than in awakening the soul. And in both, he entrusts his final messages not to Peter the rock upon which the church would be built, but to someone else, to Mary, to Judas. And that perhaps is what the institutional church could never allow. Not because it feared lies, but because it feared too many truths. If Judas's betrayal was obedience and Mary's weeping was wisdom, then the foundation of authority of who gets to teach, to interpret, to lead begins to crack. There's even a Gnostic tradition that suggests Mary and Judas understood one another. Not romantically, that's a modern fantasy, but spiritually. That they shared a knowledge of Jesus' truest nature. That they both saw behind the veil and both paid for it in silence. It's poetic, really. The man who handed Jesus over to the world and the woman who first bore witness to his return, both exiled by the very movement they helped ignite. And perhaps that's the hidden lesson that revelation is often lonely. That those entrusted with the deepest truths must often carry them without recognition or reward. That they become inevitably mirrors to one another, reflecting what others refuse to see. The Gospel of Mary ends in fragments, the pages torn, the words faded, just like the Gospel of Judas, both incomplete, both haunting, both surviving against all odds. And in their survival, they whisper something neither sermon nor statue can silence, that Judas may not have been alone in knowing the truth. And that Mary, in defending her vision, was defending his as well. If you want to hide a story, you don't burn it. You bury it deep, cold, silent. And no one knows this better than the Church. For 2,000 years, it has curated the narrative of Judas like a curator tending to a dangerous artifact, displayed just enough to remind the faithful of what not to do, but never enough to allow questions to bloom. Because the truth, if it ever leaked out, might be far too destabilizing. Beneath the marble corridors of the Vatican lie vaults no tourist will ever see. The Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, though that term proved too titillating for modern ears, holds miles of shelves, thousands of documents, many of which have never been fully translated or read in public. Inside are papal bulls' letters from emperors, trial transcripts, and perhaps, the missing pieces of Judas's story. It's not wild speculation. Throughout history, the Church has gathered and guarded apocryphal texts. Some were locked away. Others condemned as heresy indexed in the long lists of forbidden works. And every so often, a manuscript resurfaces. A gospel, a letter, a scrap of theological dynamite that survived fire and censorship. The Gospel of Judas itself was only rediscovered in the 1970s, hidden in a cave, later stored in a safe deposit box, nearly destroyed by mold and neglect. And it had been known by name to church authorities since at least the 2nd century. Irenaeus mentioned it, and likely others read it, and made sure it didn't circulate. Why such paranoia over a single disciple? Because if Judas was not a traitor, if he was chosen, then the entire scaffolding of sin redemption and hierarchy needs to be re-examined. The Church's authority depends on a clear moral binary: Jesus is pure, Judas is impure. Jesus was betrayed, Judas betrayed. Forgiveness is available but only after admission of guilt. Judas never got that moment. He was condemned too quickly, too neatly, and maybe that was the point. The Vatican, for all its grandeur, is built upon control. Control of narrative, control of memory. Throughout the centuries, popes have ordered inquisitions, suppressed texts, and issued edicts to protect doctrinal purity. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The list of forbidden books included Gnostic works, mystical commentaries, and reinterpretations of gospel events. For hundreds of years, owning such texts was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. And yet the Church preserved them. Not out of mercy, but out of necessity. You cannot fight what you do not understand, and you cannot erase something unless you know where it sleeps. The Vatican's vaults became not just a tomb of knowledge, but a fortress, a place to keep the most volatile truths under control. Some rumors whispered by archivists and esoteric historians alike suggest that alternate versions of the Passion exist in those archives. Accounts in Syriac or Coptic, a letter attributed to a disciple not named in the canonical list, referring to the one who bore the burden with honor and was misunderstood. Another tale claims a medieval monk in Avignon transcribed a gospel in which Jesus tells Judas, "You are my beloved, for without your hand the path will not open." Could these be fabrications? Certainly. But the existence of such possibilities points to a persistent undercurrent that Judas's role was never as straightforward as Sunday school made it seem, that someone somewhere knew and chose silence. Even Pope Benedict XVI, in a 2006 reflection on Holy Week, acknowledged the Gospel of Judas. He dismissed it, of course, but not without a curious note of respect. He said it showed how far the interpretation of Scripture can stray when faith is lacking. Which sounds like a warning or perhaps a veiled admission that there are interpretations still too dangerous to unpack. The papal suppression of Judas's alternative story wasn't just about fear. It was about survival. The early church needed clarity in a chaotic world. Heresies were everywhere. Theological disputes could ignite wars. A messy Judas, a sympathetic Judas, could shatter the fragile consensus that held the church together. And so the betrayal was canonized. The silver, the rope, the curse. A narrative so clean it squeaked. And anything that contradicted it was buried, or burned, or rewritten into oblivion. But stories don't die easily, especially not ones soaked in mystery and silence. You begin to wonder what still lies behind those locked doors. What fragments have yet to be read? What scrolls lie crumbling, waiting for the right eyes? And what if, just what if, the church knows more than it will ever admit, not out of malice, but out of fear? Because if Judas was loyal, if he obeyed Jesus, not betrayed him, then the entire structure of sin and salvation shifts, and the walls of the Vatican tremble ever so slightly. In the dry breath of the Egyptian desert, ancient Coptic monks once copied texts by oil lamp light, the ink soaking slowly into papyrus as prayers hummed low in the dark. Hidden among the scrolls, manuscripts, and bound codices of Nag Hammadi and beyond, there is rumored to be another one not yet fully recovered. Scholars refer to it only as the Judas Codex. Its existence is speculative, yes, but not without weight. When the Gospel of Judas was finally published in 2006, it was only because fragments of a larger text had survived smuggling, black market haggling mold, and mistranslation. That surviving codex, known formally as Codex Chakos, contains more than just the Gospel of Judas. It includes other Gnostic works too, the letter of Peter to Philip, the first apocalypse of James and Allogenes. But there's a persistent belief growing in the footnotes of certain academic papers, and whispered among desert monastery archives that a second codex once existed, one focused entirely on Judas. This hypothetical Judas codex would not just be a theological curiosity, it would be revolutionary. A focused, sustained defense, or perhaps a first-person account from the disciple who never got to speak for himself. Scholars have long noted that the Gospel of Judas ends abruptly mid-thought, as though its conclusion was torn or lost. What if that conclusion was copied elsewhere? Or what if there was another version, longer, more elaborate, hidden in a cave, that time simply hasn't yielded yet? Coptic Christians, particularly those of the early Desert Father tradition, were not always bound by Roman orthodoxy. They preserved texts rejected in the West, texts considered dangerous, not because they were false, but because they were too close to truth. The concept of a secret gospel passed among initiates whispered during night vigils isn't just romantic speculation. It's documented practice. And within that tradition, a gospel written about Judas, or perhaps even by him, would not have been out of place. Imagine a manuscript in which Judas describes the moment he was asked, not tempted, but asked to hand Jesus over, where he confesses his grief, not his guilt, where he speaks of a vision of stars falling of light separating from form of Jesus, standing outside the material world, smiling with sorrow. Such imagery fits perfectly within Gnostic symbolism. The aeons, the imperfect creators, the soul as prisoner in flesh. Judas, then, is not the traitor. He is the liberator. One Coptic document long overlooked because of its damaged condition contains a puzzling line, and the 12th said, "I do not betray, but fulfill." It's unclear whether the speaker is Judas or another apocryphal figure. But that phrasing, fulfill, not betray, rings loud, a semantic echo of earlier contradictions we've seen, a line that feels like it slipped through the red pens of centuries. The existence of a lost Judas Codex also explains something else: the vehemence with which early church fathers attacked the Cainites, a sect known for venerating figures like Judas Cain and Esau as misunderstood. If all they had was rumor and hearsay, the fury would seem disproportionate. But if they had seen, even briefly, a manuscript that redefined Judas completely, their panic makes more sense. And we know from church history that some bishops were sent specifically to Egypt to root out heretical texts, that scrolls were confiscated, monasteries purged, libraries searched. Some items were burned, others sealed. And if a Judas Codex had ever been among them, its disappearance would not be accidental. The modern church rarely comments on such possibilities. But in the restoration notes of Codex Chakos, researchers mention missing folios, torn pages, gaps in narrative structure. What if those pages aren't gone? What if they were copied into another codex, smuggled, hidden, or never opened again? Some claim that a sealed jar discovered during illegal excavations near Alminya in the 1980s was broken and its contents lost to smugglers. Others believe it contained only fragments of the same gospel we now have. But what if not? What if that jar held a longer version, the rest of the Judas Gospel, or a companion text, the idea of a second Judas document untouched by canonical redaction, free of Roman edits, is intoxicating and terrifying. Because it would mean that the story we've inherited is not just incomplete, but deliberately shaped, sculpted to serve clarity over complexity. If the Judas Codex ever surfaces, it would likely not be accepted easily, not by institutions, not by doctrine, but it wouldn't need to be. Its power would lie in the mere fact of its survival. A voice long silenced, speaking again in brittle parchment and smudged ink. And perhaps if you listen closely, that voice is already speaking. In the gaps, in the silences, in the places where betrayal sounds too neat and sacrifice sounds too familiar. step outside of the Christian tradition, and the story of Judas begins to shift subtly at first, then dramatically. In Islam, for instance, Judas is not reviled. He's not even clearly named. But the narrative that emerges around the crucifixion stands in striking contrast to the Christian version. Jesus in the Quran is not crucified at all. He is saved. It only appeared to people that he was crucified, and someone else, someone who resembled him, was taken in his place. That someone else, according to some interpretations in classical tafsir commentary, was Judas. This idea, while not universally accepted in Islamic tradition, has lingered for centuries. It presents a curious inversion. Judas the betrayer becomes Judas the substitute. He is punished, yes, but not because he turned Jesus over to the authorities. Rather, he is the one who is transformed, possibly by divine intervention, to look like Jesus, so that the real prophet could be lifted to heaven unharmed. If the Christian Gospels paint Judas as the ultimate villain, Islamic readings, though complex and varied, sometimes reframe him as a kind of decoy, a tragic double, not evil but necessary. Other Islamic traditions go further, suggesting that Judas's act was part of a divine deception to protect God's messenger from his enemies. In this view, the betrayal was never real. It was part of a larger cosmic design, and Judas either an unwitting pawn or a man who received a punishment that served a higher purpose. It's a disorienting shift, especially for those raised within the firm binaries of Christian storytelling. But it's not limited to Islam. Variations of the Judas story appear in other mystical traditions and esoteric sects, often playing with the same themes: substitution, misrecognition, and spiritual disguise. In certain Gnostic systems, especially those aligned with Valentinian thought, Judas is interpreted as a vessel of gnosis, a shadow apostle whose understanding of Jesus was higher not because of piety, but because of clarity. He saw through the illusion of physical death. He understood that to hand over Jesus was to complete the cycle to liberate the divine spark from flesh. You find echoes of this idea in Manichaean texts as well, where Judas is not named directly, but archetypes abound. The light-bearer who must break the shell, the flawed messenger who transmits the truth by playing a role the world will condemn. Even in Eastern traditions, although unrelated to Judas directly, there's the recurring idea of the holy deceiver, the one who acts against the grain to fulfill divine balance. In Hinduism, Krishna deceives. In Buddhism, there are trickster bodhisattvas who lie to awaken. These parallels aren't meant to equate Judas is unique to the Abrahamic frame, but they hint at a broader archetype, the paradoxical savior. The one whose outward actions seem profane but conceal a hidden purpose. What's fascinating is that while the Church fossilized Judas into a symbol of betrayal, the world outside it kept asking questions, kept wondering. What if this man wasn't just a villain? What if he was part of something larger, even among certain Jewish mystical sects in medieval Europe? Some obscure texts speculate that Judas was playing a role written by God himself, much like Pharaoh, whose heart was hardened to fulfill prophecy. In this reading, Judas isn't condemned for sin, but remembered with sorrow for having been chosen to bear what no one else could. It's a painful honor, if it is one. To be remembered not for your obedience, but for the mask you were asked to wear. And perhaps that's the most enduring aspect of Judas. Across all these traditions, he is the mask. The one who stands at the threshold, neither inside nor out, neither holy nor damned. A figure who holds the tension of contradiction long after the others have moved on to cleaner roles. You begin to understand that Judas is not just a man in a story. He is a test, a measure of how a tradition handles ambiguity. Christianity, needing clarity, cast him out. Islam, inheriting the tale, blurred the lines. Other mystical systems embraced him cautiously as a mirror. A mirror that asks, can you trust the one who breaks the pattern? Can you honor the one who makes the unbearable possible? Across faiths, that answer shifts. But the question persists. The number 12 echoes through sacred history, like a drumbeat. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 gates of the celestial city, 12 disciples circling the teacher. It speaks of completion, divine structure, cosmic symmetry. But what happens when a 13th appears? Not as a mistake, but as something foretold, something hidden. The idea of Judas as the 13th has long unsettled theologians. It is not merely his position in the sequence of disciples, though numerically he follows the 12. It's what that number means. 13 is the outsider, the breaker of order. In many cultures, it carries a shadow, not evil necessarily, but disruption, a sacred interference. Some fringe Gnostic texts, now lost to time, or perhaps tucked away in a vault of dust and silence, speak of a prophecy never canonized, a prophecy of a 13th one who would carry a burden the others could not. Not a burden of betrayal, but of truth. He would not just witness the mystery. He would enact it. In some versions, it was said he would fall so that others could rise. It is this notion that resurfaces whispering between the lines of the Gospel of Judas. In that cryptic text, Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Not betray, not condemn, sacrifice. And sacrifice in ancient languages means to make sacred. If Judas was the 13th, then he was not an accident. He was the final note in a sacred chord, the one who breaks the harmony not out of malice, but so the melody can transform. It is a motif you've heard before in other tales of tragic necessity. Prometheus chained for gifting fire, Odin sacrificing an eye for wisdom, the outsider who pays the price for progress. Some early mystical commentaries even hint that Jesus' mission could not be completed without one among the 12 stepping outside the circle, that the teachings needed a trigger, a catalyst, not a villain, but a fulcrum. And Judas, whether he understood it fully or not, became that fulcrum. Later theologians would wrestle with this. Augustine famously wrote that God can bring good even out of evil. But what if the act itself wasn't evil at all? What if it only appeared so from the outside? What if Judas was playing a part he was asked to play, knowing that no one would ever thank him for it? One particularly obscure tradition from the 2nd century, found in a tattered commentary attributed to the Scythian school, refers to the 13th star. It doesn't name Judas directly, but speaks of a luminous figure cast out by the others whose fall marks the awakening of the aeons. Whether this was meant metaphorically or cosmologically is unknown, but it casts a long, strange shadow backward toward that upper room in Jerusalem, and the man who left before the meal was over. 13. The seat left empty. The one name whispered but not mourned. The presence always removed from iconography. Even Da Vinci, in his famous Last Supper, paints Judas clutching his silver separate in gesture and light. Yet he's there, not erased, present, unignorable. In medieval mystery plays, Judas was sometimes portrayed with a red halo not of sainthood, but of blood. Not divine, but chosen. A symbol perhaps of sacrifice misunderstood, or just the theater of guilt passed down century after century until no one remembered the script, only the condemnation. Yet despite every attempt to silence or simplify him, Judas remains unquiet. He does not vanish like other forgotten names. His shadow returns again and again, asking not for forgiveness, but for understanding. If there was a prophecy of the 13th, then it was never meant for celebration. it was meant as a warning. That truth, when it arrives, doesn't always wear white robes and speak kindly. Sometimes it comes in the form of a kiss at night under torchlight in a garden where the others are sleeping. You begin to sense the shape of something terrible and beautiful, that maybe Judas wasn't written out of the divine story. Maybe he was written deeper into it than any of us dared to see. And if that's true, then everything we've believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and divine will must be reread, backward, in silence, in the language of the 13th. It's time now to gather the fragments, the lost scrolls, the buried verses, the whispers behind the painted icons. You followed the trail from dusty caves in Egypt to the censored pages of canonized scripture, from the coded gestures of art to the fevered writings of apocryphal visionaries. And now, as the path winds toward its end, you see something that was never meant to be seen. Not a villain, not a thief of destiny, but a key. Judas, the name we've spat for centuries, doesn't vanish under the weight of all this evidence, he clarifies. His silhouette sharpens into view, no longer cloaked in simplistic treachery, but textured with mystery, depth, and unbearable necessity. He did not run from the light. He walked directly into the dark, possibly because he was asked to. Possibly because no one else would. It begins with the Gospel of Judas, that defiant scroll exhumed from desert silence. It tells of secret knowledge passed to Judas alone, a divine confidence not shared with the others. This wasn't favoritism, it was function. Jesus, in that narrative, needed someone who understood the cost, who wouldn't flinch. The canonical Gospels present a man isolated, demonic, driven by greed. Yet those same texts stumble under the weight of contradiction. Why would Jesus, portrayed as divine, all-knowing, choose Judas at all if his betrayal was inevitable? Why not dismiss him early, replace him, warn the others? Unless betrayal wasn't the point. Unless the betrayal was never betrayal at all. In several early fragments, the ones sifted from the sands of Qumran and the whisper-thin leaves of Gnostic compilations, we find a recurring pattern, a necessary fall, a chosen outcast. Someone set apart not to destroy the plan, but to fulfill it. Even the infamous kiss, so often portrayed as venomous, reads differently under this lens. It wasn't venom, it was signal. A private act in a public moment, known only to the two who shared its meaning. And the silver weighed so heavily in the myths, not a bribe, but a ritual token. A symbol of something completed, not sold. Judas's absence from later theological debates may not be proof of his disgrace, but of fear. Fear that his role, if examined too closely, might unravel the whole drama of sin redemption and divine will as the Church had written it. So instead, they rewrote him. They gave his face to every act of treachery, painted him hanging from trees, named demons after him. Because what is more terrifying than a man who did the right thing and could never be forgiven for it? This is the tragedy at the heart of Judas. Not that he failed, but that he succeeded in a task no one else dared accept. He bore the hatred of history so that a larger story could unfold. And maybe he never expected vindication. Maybe that was part of the price. But you've seen him now, behind the veils of doctrine, behind the smoke of sermons and the flicker of flames. You've read the lines they tried to erase, felt the tension between betrayal and obedience. And the deeper truth, the unbearable truth, is that the man who kissed Jesus in Gethsemane may have loved him more than any other, not because he was weak, but because he was willing. In every great myth, there is a hidden hinge, the moment the story turns not through triumph, but through sacrifice misunderstood. In this story, that hinge has a name, and it's not traitor, it's Judas. It's quiet now. The storm of Scripture, the clash of doctrine, the hiss of censored voices, all of it fades like incense on the wind. You sit with the silence, and in that silence Judas remains. Not as a curse, not as a wound, but as a question. One that outlasts empires. You've walked through ancient caverns past fragments that defied centuries of dust and denial. You've watched as parchment turned to fire and words became exile. You've heard the echoes of Jesus calling not for resistance, but for release, telling Judas to do quickly what must be done. Not with rage, but recognition. And now, under the dim glow of understanding, you see what was hidden in plain sight. This was never just a story of betrayal. It was a story of obedience, a brutal, selfless, lonely obedience. And Judas, he may have been the only one who understood. The sand softens beneath your feet as the last image settles a scroll, buried a kiss in the dark, a man walking alone into history's fire. There is no statue to him, no cathedral, no feast day. Only this shadowed truth surfacing at last. History loves its villains clean. Sharp lines, sharp stones. But truth is quieter than that. More patient. Judas never asked to be exonerated. He asked only to be remembered rightly. Perhaps now he is. So rest now, fellow traveler. Let the scrolls lie still. Let the candles burn low. Whatever secrets still sleep beneath the desert sands or behind sealed Vatican walls tonight, you've heard enough. Drift gently and dream of a man misunderstood.